All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Avoiding Debilitating Cyber Attacks for Your Healthcare Organization. Today's program will be presented by Manuel Capello, vCISO and lead Threat Intelligence and Vulnerability Management, and with them Cyber and Information Security Services team. Before we begin, I have a few notes. Today's materials can be found in the toolbar on the right of your screen. Also, at the bottom of the toolbar, you will see a questions box. Feel free to send us your questions during the presentation. We will do our best to address them at the end. There will be 5 polling questions throughout the program. To qualify for CPE credit, you must participate in each poll. CPE certificates will be emailed to you within a few weeks. And finally, once the webinar is over, there will be a pop-up asking you to complete a survey of today's webinar. Please take a moment to complete it. It is our way of being able to provide you with the best and most relevant programs possible. With that, I'll turn it over to Manny.
Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about ransomware and specifically avoiding debilitating cyber attacks for your healthcare organization regarding ransomware. 92% of the cost of a ransomware attack is in recovery costs. And that goes into the economics of ransomware, and that is one of the primary things that we're going to be talking about today. Sorry, my slides weren't progressing as I expected. This is just kind of like a, I don't know what you want to call it, but this is my get out of jail free card. I'm going to be talking about the economics of ransomware. I'm going to be talking about the anatomy of attacks and how you can, defend against some of the common ransomware attacks. But I'm not providing any legal advice, even if I say I mention something that has to do with regulations or legal compliance. I'm not giving any legal advice whatsoever. And I highly recommend you talk to a lawyer who is an expert in cybersecurity, which there are plenty now because there's a lot of money in that field. Today's objectives are going to be the analysis of the economics of ransomware. We're going to talk about how ransomware makes money from beginning to end as business operations. We're going to identify the anatomy of a ransomware attack, what a ransomware attack looks like from a business operations perspective on the hacker side. And we're going to use that as a means to develop and examine some defenses against ransomware. And a lot of these defenses that we're going to talk about are also adequate defenses against various different types of hacks, but they're in particular, they'll work really well against ransomware. Now, ransomware industrial complex is a real thing. It's 4 to 6 billion in payouts over 2 years. This is the last 2 years. These are recent numbers. 75 billion in total losses, and like I said, 92% of that is in recovery costs. So that's legal fees, incident response fees, man hours spent to bring up the cost of backups, reestablishing those backups. And to date, the largest payout for ransomware was paid by Brenntag this year, I think, and that's $4.4 million. Now, the initial ask was $7.5 million, so that the hacker gang, the ransomware gang, they initially requested $7.5 million, but through negotiation, they were able to bring it down to 4.4 million. And you'll see that as we move forward through the economics of ransomware, that the ransomware gangs, they want to make money just like anybody else. And it's almost like a bazaar where you can walk in, or you're basically forced to walk into, but you get to negotiate your way out. In healthcare, in 2020, there have been 92 ransomware attacks. I don't know how many there have been in 2021 yet, so because some of these take some time to surface as far as being reported. And this has had an impact of about $20 million in the US alone. Again, remember, 92% of that is in recovery fees. And this is kind of spread out across pharmaceuticals, hospitals, clinics, private practices. So the whole health healthcare sector is being affected. Now, the CEO of FireEye has said this: pharmaceuticals, hospitals, healthcare, public companies, organizations that don't have the talent and skill to defend themselves, they're getting sucker punched. Basically, what he's saying is what most in the cyber industry understand, and that is the hackers go for the soft targets, right? Yes, Facebook gets hacked, sure. Microsoft gets hacked. These guys are targets because there's tons of money and there's tons of prestige, really, and getting in and breaking into one of those systems. But soft targets are always easier, right? There was a bank robber many years ago, and they asked him, "Why do you rob banks?" And he says, "Well, that's where all the money is at." And that's why hackers go after healthcare. That's why hackers go after dealerships, because some of these industries have not really caught up with the common standard practices for defenses. And so, HIPAA, as an example, as a regulation, has shown it really isn't enough to take the healthcare sector and move it into a position of strength. And so healthcare is a target. And until healthcare moves into that position of strength, they're going to remain a target. So let's talk about the economics of ransomware. And as we move into that, let's throw up the first polling question.
All right, so our first poll: what is the average recovery cost of a cyber attack in healthcare?
And I can't actually see the polling question, so I don't know. I won't know when it's done.
We'll close it in about 20 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close it out, and here are the results. So it looks like 74% of you did 1.4 million.
And we've got a very smart crowd here. 1.4 million is the correct answer. And there's a caveat to this, because we are talking about an average. Your smaller healthcare organizations, this is very revenue dependent, right? Because hackers, when they've actually gotten a foothold, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but when they've actually gotten a foothold, or prior to, because they're doing a very specific targeted attack, they understand the business that they're going after to a degree enough where they think they can get a certain amount out of the company. So if you only have, $2 million in revenue, they're not going to ask for a $1.4 million ransomware payment, right? They're going to ask for something that is commensurate to what you make, to what they think they can squeeze out of you. So just keep that in mind. That's the caveat for $1.4 million. Now, a lot of people think of hackers, particularly hackers who use ransomware, as just some guy on his computer or multiple computers. It's more of a side hustle, but it's not a side hustle anymore. Hopefully, people see that. Basically, starting back in, say, 2017, since the major leak of all the CIA tools, like particularly Eternal Blue, ransomware attacks have become big business. $4 to $6 billion, $75 million in total losses. So big business is ransomware. And when you get into big business, you're now dealing with economics, like large scale economics. And ransomware it's a form of malware, and ransomware attacks are supported malware as a service, right? Think of the customer in malware as a service as the hacker, right? So the hacker, he wants to make some money. He has an idea. He has a little bit of skill. There's certain things he can do, but he can't do everything. So he can reach out to a support system, and that support system includes support centers. We're talking help desks that help him, and help desks that also help him negotiate the ransomware that eventually gets paid out. So that the hacker himself may not actually do the ransomware. And it is in the best interest of this support center or this help desk to actually treat their customers well. And they do. I mean, other than the fact they're extorting you along the lines of, hey, you know, it's a shame, you got a nice business there, it's a shame that something happened to it. They're actually try to treat them nice because, you know, honey, it's the honey and vinegar analogy, right? And there are payment centers to collect payment, because you're not sending a cashier's check or a written check or cash in an envelope. You're paying via crypto. And so they want to make sure that you understand how to go get your crypto, how to pay your crypto, and where to send it to the crypto wallets, whatever those might be, so they can collect it in the safest way possible and get as much money as possible. And there are also third-party vendors for these hackers as well. You know, I'm sure many of you here today have some form or use some form of third-party vendor, and hackers, they do that too, right? Somebody's going to develop the actual exploit kit, someone's going to develop a phishing kit, someone's going to develop the actual malware, someone's going to develop the ransomware, and what the hacker does is he gets all these pieces and he puts them together, and then he delivers those packages to the victim. We'll talk about how that's done. So once the hacker has his package, like how does he get it into the network of a victim, right? Because he's got to get into the network of a victim, that's got to spread across the network, and that's going to start locking up systems and then demand a ransomware payment. So there are 4 primary ways that this takes place. The first one, sure, everyone's heard of phishing, right? Phishing, still very successful. It's not, if you looked at the numbers, it doesn't take up as large of a percentage of intrusions as it used to, and that's because credential stuffing has picked up a lot of steam. So I'm not really going to talk about phishing other than what I just said, because I'm sure most of you are familiar with phishing. Now, credential stuffing is a form of brute force attack. Now, the old traditional brute force attack where you have a username and then you just try password after password after password, that isn't really used anymore. It hasn't been used like that for quite some time, because the defenses against it are fairly simple. They don't even have to be sophisticated. You just lock out someone's system after a few minutes or after a few false attempts, and then that's it. Credential stuffing, on the other hand, is where they have a ton of usernames, okay, and a ton of user passwords, and they will match those together and then roll through that big list. Think of it like a warehouse with 1,000 doors. Each door has a different lock on it, and you have a combination. And instead of trying 1,000 combinations on one lock, you try that one combination on all thousands of those locks. One of those just might open. That's what credential stuffing is. Exploitation, that is like, you know, the standard, what people think of when they think of hacking. When you think of, you know, you might see in the movies where a guy sits at a computer and he finds a vulnerability and he exploits the vulnerability, and now he has a remote code execution on a server. So now he can cause the server to do things that it was not intended to do, at least for him anyways. And then the fourth one, which may be the scariest one depending on who you are, is direct access. Now, as far as the economics go, these are often IT administrators who sell access to servers in an organization. They sell that access for whatever they want. But it is not always the case, and sometimes it is just a hacker who managed to get in, but that is all he wants to do. He just got in, and now he's going to turn around, because maybe he's just really good at finding remote code executions and getting onto a system, but then what he does is he turns around and he sells access to whoever for whatever they want to use. And how hard is it to find this kind of direct access from access brokers? It's not hard. If you kind of know where you're looking, it takes about 15 minutes of searching in the dark web. So I went out last night and I looked for something, and here's one to a database in Iran. It's $600, and the prices range from $600 to $6,000. And all you got to do is PM the guy, and then he'll, you PM him, you pay him, he gives you access. So once the hacker has access, he's got to make his actual money back, right? He spent money on the support system, on the exploit kits, on the phishing kits, on his third-party vendors. Now, he's made his initial investment. When I say he, I'm really referring to a group of people, usually, right, who are working together, who probably have backers themselves, investors. So that investment has been made, and now they got to get their money back. So how do they get their money back? How do they turn what they've done into money that they get? Well, the obvious one and the common first one is ransomware payouts, right? So they convince a company to pay out the ransom. There's a negotiation back and forth as to how much the ransom is going to be. There's the initial ask, and often, companies who decide to pay are not paying the initial ask. It is whittled down to something that both parties agree on. But what happens if a company refuses to pay? Now, in some cases, a company, like for example, a very large staffing firm out in England, back in 2019, they were breached. There was ransomware on their systems. They refused to pay. They restored from backup, and everything seemed fine. Problem is, they didn't solve the problem as to how the ransomware got there in the first place. And about 3 months later, that ransomware beaconed back out to the ransomware gang, says, "Hey, I'm alive again." They reinserted themselves into the system, into the network. They activated the ransomware again, and that same staffing agency had to go through the whole thing all over again. Now, they refused to pay the ransomware again, as far as anybody knows, and they restored from backup. But they basically had to go through all the recovery expenses twice. So what happens if you refuse, like if maybe that's not your exact situation, and you go, okay, ransomware gang, you know what, we're not going to pay you. So they can turn around, the ransomware gang, they can turn around and say, look, fine, maybe you don't want your data back. This is what we'll do. We're going to take your data and we're going to go sell it, whatever that might be. And we're not just going to sell it. We're going to make sure everybody knows that you've had a breach. We're going to attach this breach to you. So if you have any regulatory fines that you might be liable for, you're probably going to have to pay those. And it might just be cheaper to give us the ransom instead of dealing with paying all, the $250 per record, whatever that cost is, depending on what regulatory liability you might be underneath. We have, it's $250,000 per record. We have 10,000 records or 100,000 records. You do the math, give us the money or we dump it out, right? And that seems to work too. And that would be like a form of that would be the form of blackmail, right? You do this, or I let everybody know you have a data breach and you'll have to pay even more money. Yeah, we won't get any money, but it is really going to hurt you. So now let's talk about, we'll go a little bit deeper into the anatomy of the ransomware attack. We'll pause for polling question number 2.
All right, for our second polling question, Feinstein Institute for Medical Research paid how much to settle a data breach after one of its laptops with data was stolen? All right, about 20 more seconds. Ten seconds. All right, I'm going to close it out. And here are the results. This looks like 83% of you voted 3.9 million.
That's really good. Again, smart crowd. Yep, they had to pay, it was 13,000 patient records that were stolen, and they had to pay $3.9 million in liabilities based on the cost per record. And eventually we'll get to the how do you prevent ransomware so that you can kind of reduce your risk of having to make those kind of liability payments. So as we've already discussed, phishing, credential stuffing are two ways that they can distribute their ransomware. Now there's, I have actually a little a picture here of credential stuffing here in a second, but external remote desktop, now this is one I see a lot, and this is a, many of you probably have this on your desktop where maybe you've shared out access to your desktop so that you can get to it from another system. Well, some IT folks, they do this internally as well, where they'll take a desktop and they'll share it out to the rest of the world. And they figure, well, because they have a username and password, they're good to go. They're safe. This is maybe one of the worst practices out there because the Windows remote desktop regularly has problems. The Eternal Blue that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that was kind of exposed to the world because of the CIA tools were hacked and the NSA tools were hacked. That was converted into what was called Blue Keep, that was packaged up as ransomware, and Blue Keep basically attacked a remote desktop that was exposed to the rest of the world and would get on to get onto that system and then just spread like wildfire. So now credential stuffing, like I said before, the way this works is you just basically, you go out, you grab a list of passwords and you grab a list of usernames, and then you start just doing combinations of usernames and passwords. But you don't stay with one username and then just roll through a bunch of passwords. What you do is you mix it up. And there's a couple different smart ways that attackers mix it up. One, they know that most people reuse passwords. Now, they may not use the same password for everything, but they'll have some of their systems that have the same password or a very similar password. And so a lot of these username and passwords are exposed through some other breach. Like, for example, here, this is an output from a Hotmail breach, and you can see some passwords there. Right, so these are real passwords, Corey2K1123. Okay, now whoever this person is, okay, they may use this password in other areas because people get tired of trying to remember so many passwords, so they try to make it easy for themselves. So the attacker will cycle through. They will cycle through this password through multiple, say, different types of user accounts where this person may have access. Or they'll take popular passwords, and because people tend to use the same passwords, it's funny how people end up using the same password. Here you see this one says Corey2K1, right? And then they'll take these bots and they'll cycle all through all these bots. So they'll have different bots kind of attacking the same system. So if you say block one bot, you're still getting hit with all these other bots. And they distribute these bots across various IP network segments, making it difficult to just shut it all down. And so credential stuffing has been a way is really the primary way that business email compromise happens. And this is also a way they get into VPNs. This is a way they get into, Office 365. A lot of accesses are achieved. A lot of foothold is achieved through this. And I'm spending a little time on this because the defenses that we're going to talk about later connect back to phishing, which everybody knows pretty much about, and credential stuffing. So external remote desktop, as I mentioned before, right? You could find this information, right? This is not hard information to find. So I just did a little quick search, and there are 895,000 instances of Windows remote desktop exposed to the internet. So if you make a connection, right? If you try to use the little app on your Windows computer, you bring it up and you go here, you find this, you get these IPs, you throw it in, and you get this little kind of like, I'm connecting here, initiating remote connection. And if this pops up, right? So this is a check you can do on your own systems. If you're external to the network and then this pops up where it says remote desktop connection right here, if you get this window, that is a bad sign. After remote desktop connection here, what you should go is it should be like you have no access, which means there's probably some kind of defenses in front of it. So how does it spread? So it can get on via phishing, it can get on via credential stuffing, it can get on via remote desktop that's vulnerable or poorly configured. And so once it's on the network, it is initially only on one system, locking up one system, unless it is the system for the company, unless it is the system where all your data is on, which it probably isn't, hopefully. It now needs to spread. And it either needs to spread to enough, say, end user systems and lock it down so nobody can do work, or it needs to spread to the critical data, the systems where the critical data is stored, even if it's in the cloud, and lock that down so that you can't do work and they can steal that data and dump it out and blackmail you if you don't pay out. And this is done through vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and dangerous protocols. Now, vulnerabilities are what happens when a program does something that is, a program has a bug, and then a hacker can utilize that bug and make the program do something it is not intended to do. When I say program, I also mean operating system. Operating system is just one big program with thousands of layers, right? So they find a bug, they utilize that bug, they throw a bunch of stuff at it, and then eventually figure out that, oh, it cannot consume this thing that I'm throwing at it properly, and it just kind of barfs on itself. And when it barfs on itself, I can then make it do what I want it to do. That's basically what a vulnerability is, right? So it is code that has an error. And when you're talking about something like Microsoft or Linux or some kind of program, we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of code. There's going to be errors there. And so you have researchers, both good and bad, who sit there and they just pound on these applications and on these operating systems until they find a bug that they can then use to make the computer, make the system do something it was not intended to do. So vulnerabilities is a way that it spreads. And when that vulnerability is discovered, they build that into the package so that when it gets onto the network, it can use those vulnerabilities because it already has a kind of like a vulnerability exploit package built into it to then find on the network and exploit and just kind of start spidering out to the endpoints. Again, that's the most famous one, or one of the most famous ones, WannaCry or Petya and NotPetya. That is how they worked. They utilized SMB, which is kind of like when you go out to a file share. That is a protocol that allows you to go out to a file share. That's how all that's that's done, and it just spread because everyone's got file shares, and Windows has those the Windows endpoints, like your operating system that you're using just to do your daily work. It's not just servers. That has that same protocol open so that it can access file shares, and it just boom, it just spreads that way. Now, misconfigurations are not vulnerabilities in the sense that I just described them. Misconfigurations are when you're setting up the system to use a system, you set it up wrong, right? So permissions is a big one where your IT guy sets up your roles and what you should have access to. And because we're usually talking about layered permissions where you have parent and child permission sets, the more stuff that ends up working together, eventually misconfigurations show up. In the same way bugs show up in software, misconfigurations show up. And you can discover these misconfigurations because some of them are very common. You can discover and find your way to find a way to take advantage of and leverage those misconfigurations to spread throughout the network. And the third way is dangerous protocols. Dangerous protocols are basically old protocols that there is nothing you can do about. In terms of patching. So it's not, you can't like patch a protocol. You just have to stop using it, which can degrade sometimes a company's ability to do work. So here you have to kind of decide what is the risk that you want to take, because these protocols that are considered dangerous are very dangerous. One example is, I didn't write this down, so it's called LLMNR. And that's basically how Windows systems talk to each other so that they know where to go. It's a way to identify who is who. And when a hacker, this protocol is so old and it's so well known that hackers basically can build this into their exploit packages where you can pretend to be something, to be a system that another system is looking for. You go, hey, you're looking for system ABD, that is me, send me your username and password. And so the username and password get sent. And then now you have a username password that you can use. You can find out where does this username and password have access to inside the network. And there's a lot of protocols like that. That is a way that ransomware can spread. And I don't know how the questions work in here. So if you have a question on any of this, please just don't hesitate to ask, and then I'll do my best to answer. So now that you have, not you, but now that a hacker, he's gotten on, he's spread across the network, he's locked the data, right? Because it's ransomware. But they also, because if they're going to dump the data out in public and say hit you with blackmail, they got to get the data off the network. They got to get the data off the system and out of your control so that they can do stuff with it, sell it, dump it out onto the open market for people to use however they want, or to say tarnish your reputation, force you to pay the liabilities, whatever liabilities might come along with this because you've been breached. And the two primary ways that they get out is through unmonitored protocols. So that would be like a DNS, FTP, SSH, any protocol that is not properly monitored, where you usually need a tool to monitor it properly, or legitimate web traffic. And that legitimate web traffic, could be Dropbox or Google Drive, where they have an account and they use that account to just move all your information, but everything that they're stealing up to there. Now, common defense here, I'll just throw this out because I don't really talk about it when we get to the defense part, is to just stop using those types of file share without some very, very tight controls around that. So we've talked about how they make their money, how they get onto your system and how it spreads, how they get off. So what can you do about it now? What can anybody do to stop these guys? Because, if you watch the news, it's constant. It's people are constantly getting attacked. So let's take a break though and do poll question number 3.
All right, here's our third polling question. How much do you spend to safeguard profit generating mechanisms? All right, about 20 more seconds. All right, 10 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close it out. And here are the results. Looks like 46% of you voted not sure, never thought about it before.
All right, is that the highest percentage?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, so the reason why I asked that question, this is a common question I ask for these presentations, because I'm always curious what kind of thought people have put into this, or what percentage of, you know, how they balance out and rate the risk to determine how much money they should spend to protect the money that they have. You know, if you have a bar of gold, is it worth putting in a cardboard box? No, cardboard box is going to do anything, but it's probably, if you just have a single bar of gold, it's probably not worth spending $1 million to protect either, right? So there's somewhere in there's the right amount that you need to spend. And this is pertinent to when we get to the discussions of what the actual, or what some actual mitigating solutions are for ransomware, because some of these have a variety of price ranges. And you'll have to kind of do a little, not research, you'll have to do a little risk assessment to determine what level of defense do you want to do on any one of these, and if any one of these are even worth doing as far as your finances are concerned.
All right, and then I believe on to our
polling question number 4.
Does your business use multi-factor authentication to protect important technology or data? All right, 20 more seconds. All right, 10 seconds. All right, I'm going to close it out. And here are the results. So it looks like the majority, 68%, voted yes.
Okay, that's good. Did anybody say number 1 or number 2? Like, what are the percentages there?
Looks like 4% did number 1 and 28% voted for number 2.
Okay. All right, so some of this then will be not new information if you're in the we are doing something about it. Well, not entirely new information. So here's the 80-20. In other words, what little effort can you put in to get out big effort? Multi-factor authentication, email protection, vulnerability scans and management, and then network segmentation. I put network segmentation kind of on the bottom of that first group because it can be difficult to implement properly and can be easily taken too far or not taken far enough. Now, the second group require a little bit more effort, and so technically probably wouldn't fall in the 80-20. But if you're already doing the first group, that second group, response plans, asset management, and patch management, are there to add or enhance what you're already doing. So I want to talk about multi-factor authentication, and because there are some do's and don'ts, there's some bad and good for multi-factor authentication. So if for those of you who are thinking about doing it, here's some considerations to take. And if those of you who are doing it, here's maybe some checks that you can make. So the bad for multi-factor authentication are personal questions, and they may actually be the worst. I know organizations still use them, even banks, which drives me nuts, because it is not hard to find the answers to these questions with social media. The answers to these questions are not difficult to find. So what I do with organizations that force me to do these personal questions or these security questions is I just basically I make that another password, usually a long string of complex characters that could never be guessed in a million years by even the strongest computer. And I write down the password. I have a password generator, or I write down the question. I have a password generator that does that, and then I put that in there. So that would be my recommendation. But if you can avoid using security questions, avoid using security questions. SMS is another one where you usually you get a code sent to you by the organization via SMS, and this worked initially. Now, multi-factor authentication has been around for well over a decade at this point. When it first started, it wasn't a bad option, but hackers, being who they are, have found a way around that. And they found a way to both man in the middle, the SMS, and to basically generate codes that are sent that look like they're sent from the organization that people then click on or utilize, which is really just the hacker taking advantage of the system. And passwords, and I threw that in there because passwords, some people see passwords as a second form, because we're talking about multi-factor, right? The first form would be something your username, and then, oh, you also know your password. So that's two things, multi-factor. That's not multi-factor, having a password. And I'm probably, hopefully I'm telling everybody here something you already know. Username and password is not two factors. That is a single factor, because it's something you know. Passwords are an old way of securing access to a system. They're not the worst of these three options, and they're probably not moving to a passwordless authentication, as in no passwords authentication, anytime soon. I say like the next 2 to 5 years. There are solutions that exist, but it's not something you can implement across an enterprise and have access to all of your stuff without passwords, without spending a ton of money. So we're still kind of stuck with passwords to a certain extent. So if you're going to still have passwords, and you're not doing multi-factor, so if you're in that group where you're not doing multi-factor, the new standard, and this is Microsoft, this is NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have done away with so change your password every 30, 60, 90 days. Is now you only need to change your password once a year, but your password should be a 16-character passphrase. So they've done away with the idea of complexity. You don't need special characters, uppercase, lowercase, numbers. You don't need to enforce that anymore. You need 16-character passphrase that you only have to change once a year, unless a breach has happened or something's been compromised. Then you change passwords. Okay, so let's move on from that. So what are the good forms of multi-factor authentication? And the 4 here under good, these are the good forms of multi-factor authentication. YubiKeys, hard token authentication codes, soft token authentication codes, and certificates. Certificates, I have pictures of the others, so I'm just going to say here, certificates are a cryptographic hash that you have on your system or your mobile device that is required in order for you to gain access to either the network or the resource that you're trying to gain access to. So you still have your username and your password, but you also have to have this certificate, which would be the second factor for your authentication, something you have in order to gain access to the resource or system. And there is an underlying, say, management infrastructure that is required to use certificates, but it's a pretty good option. So YubiKeys, that's the one on the left. That gives you access. That is something that you have. You see there, it is basically USB or NFC. So you can plug it in your computer to gain access to stuff. It'll read the presence of the key, or you can press it against your phone if you're logging in. If you have like your Office 365 stuff on your phone for your work, you need to log in to check something, you just press it against the back of your phone. Your phone picks up the signal and it logs you in. On top of what other factor that you're using. It's fairly secure, but it's not that it's never had problems, because it has. Google has the Google Titan, and they found a bug in their YubiKey a few years ago, and there was a recall where they just sent out new keys to everybody who had the version of the key that had the issue. The one in the middle, maybe some people are familiar with. This is the hard token, in the sense that it is something you carry around for that purpose only, right? And so these have been around for at least 20 years. And so you can use this to log into your system. That code changes, and you type that code in on top of your username and password. And then there's the soft version of this, which these are becoming more popular. Right there, that's the Microsoft version. Google has a version, and there are say vendors that have produced versions that they're marketing towards enterprise use, like Duo, for example. I think they were recently bought, or not recently, a couple of years ago, bought by Oracle. But you can use these to actually, in some cases, some fairly tight granularity, where you can even put two-factor or multi-factor authentication on a file itself. So if you can say, well, I want multi-factor on this file server, or I want multi-factor on this account, like a server that shares files, right? But then you select a file that's, say, of all files that you would say classify as critical importance themselves also have multi-factor, so you have to put a code in to even open the file. So multi-factor email protection. How do you protect your email? There are three phases in which you can protect your email. You never get the email. The phishing email never even gets to your organization. You can do it so the email comes to your organization, but it doesn't get to the employee. That's before you get the email. And then it can be after you get the email. The email gets the employee, so it makes it through the first, never get. It makes it through the second, before you get, and it gets to the employee, and his security awareness doesn't pay off, so he clicks on something, right? Well, how do you protect from that? So you can protect your domain, because attackers will see how secure your domain is. So if you're acme.com and it doesn't have SPF, DKIM, or DMARC, they can spoof your domain and just start sending emails from your domain. If you put those things on, Another form of domain protection that you can have is protection from, say, typo squattings or domain squattings, where somebody buys a domain that looks like it. So instead of acme.com, it's acme.net, or a slight misspelling that people are not going to pick up on, like an I instead of an L. And they create their own SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records so that it looks real. So when somebody gets it, they're not paying close enough attention, and it looks real, looks official. They click on something. So if you put those protections in place, there are services where you can buy protection from, say, typo squatting. So you don't have to go out and buy everything that looks similar to yours. You just pay a small fee, and then when somebody registers something in that, say, that spelling some range, you'll be notified. The second phase, before you get the email, this is basically a piece of equipment or a service, protection as a service, security as a service. There are vendors that do it like Mimecast and Proofpoint. What they'll do is they'll scan the email, they'll scan it for malicious URLs, malware, and they'll even allow you to train your users by performing your own simulated phishing campaigns that train your users what to look for and what to do in case they get a scamming email. And if all the other two fail and something gets through and somebody clicks on something, you need to have you want protection there. That's antivirus, endpoint protection, but that's not your 80/20, right? But most people probably have some form of antivirus. Most people probably need to move to some form of endpoint protection. But your 80/20, it is your phishing and your multi-factor and your scanning, right? So you go out, you buy a scanning service, you pay a small fee, monthly fee, and they will scan your external network and come in and scan your internal network. These are not expensive, and they're highly valuable because you will know where all your vulnerabilities are, which will then allow you to make smart decisions, because you can then evaluate your vulnerabilities. What are you actually at risk at? And then you can decide what to do about them. You can track them and you can patch them, which is why I mentioned before, patch management can be important. But most people have some form of patch management, but when you start incorporating that with vulnerabilities, that changes the dynamic a little bit. Polling question number 5.
All right, our fifth and final polling question. Have you consulted a cyber firm to assess your current state of security? All right, 20 more seconds. All right, 15 more seconds. Reminder to get your votes in to get CPE credit. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. And here are the results. This looks like 77% of you voted yes, I'm not a wild-eyed maniac.
Okay. That's good to hear. So in your consultations, hopefully, well, we can't really, not being together means we can't really have a conversation here. So I'm just going to try to make some guesses. But hopefully they have provided you some kind of advice on some of the things that I've already talked about. They've talked to you about multi-factor authentication. They've talked to you about how to protect yourself from phishing. And they've talked to you about vulnerability assessments, particularly vulnerability scans. One of the other things that you should probably do, and this is not a defense that you implement, but you want to know your diagnosis on a regular basis, because your condition is constantly changing. Since there is new data, system updates that you don't even have control over, new systems that are being introduced into your infrastructure, systems that are leaving, new people coming on, new people leaving. This creates a highly dynamic situation where vulnerabilities and misconfiguration can just kind of pop up. And vulnerabilities and misconfigurations together can create some really unique circumstances that vulnerability scans themselves are never going to discover. So you want to also do higher levels of vulnerability assessments, like a penetration test or a red team assessment or a risk assessment. With a penetration test, basically somebody comes in and pretends to be a hacker. It is not just a scan anymore. They're coming in and they're emulating the tactics and the techniques that a hacker would emulate to see where other issues exist on your infrastructure that a person would take advantage of, that a vulnerability scanner is not going to discover. So if hopefully that is something that is in the discussions when you've consulted with a cybersecurity firm. You should be doing that at least once a year as far as a penetration test. You should be doing vulnerability scans. The standard is quarterly, but I think every other month, if not monthly, is really what you should be doing, because the time between when a bug is discovered in a vulnerability and an exploit is made for that bug, and then when the vulnerability itself is published, that is, when everybody else in the world, like Microsoft, knows the vulnerability exists, is 7 days on average. That means hackers are aware, nefarious, malicious hackers are aware of the vulnerability and have found a way to exploit that vulnerability at least a week before the vendors are aware of it, on average. Sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. So if you wait 30 days to scan, you're 37 days behind the ball. And that's monthly. If you only scan quarterly, there is a much higher risk of a hacker identifying and taking advantage of that vulnerability, especially if it's an external vulnerability, because they write these bots that just sweep the entire internet on a regular basis looking for vulnerabilities that then they just take advantage of. It's not like it's a guy sitting at a computer. Okay, I'm gonna look at this website. Well, now I'm gonna move to the next website. No, they have armies of zombie systems that work at their beck and call, constantly scanning the internet, and looking for vulnerabilities. There is a truism in cybersecurity where within 8 minutes of you standing up a new system on the internet, it is already being scanned by one of those bots. So, I mean, if you have any kind of technological, IT capability, you can put that to the test. Go to DigitalOcean's, stand up a system, and just wait for it to get scanned. Wait for it for somebody to try to log in. It'll happen on average, on 8 minutes. So I see that's really all I have. I see there are no questions that have been brought up, but if there are any questions now, I suppose now's the time before we end it.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any come in right now, but a recording of this session and the PowerPoint will be emailed out to you later this week. We'll add Mandy's contact information in case any questions do